You're listening to The Rob and Tristan Show. Today's show is brought to you by RefBox. RefBox, keeping your kids in bounds.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. Today we're going to be covering the topic of identity theft. As always, my co-host Tristan sitting here across from me. How's it going, Tristan?
Hey, you doing all right, Rob?
One of the things I wanted to do was to bring up a fairly famous identity theft story. It was pretty impactful. A guy's name was Abraham Abdallah, and Abraham was a busboy for a restaurant, a pretty unassuming guy. But in his spare time, he turned out he was an identity thief, and he managed to rip off some of the wealthiest people on the planet. His list of victims include Steven Spielberg, Oprah Winfrey, Warren Buffett, Ted Turner, just to name a few. And he managed to achieve this using their email and a number of other digital methods to build archives of their personal data, enough to the point where he was able to convince banks that he was the financial advisor for each of these people. And then he was able to begin moving money and buying products through their accounts as though it was on their behalf. And the only reason he was caught is someone had caught wind of the fact that multiple packages were moving around to different locations in the country under the name of Steven Spielberg. And somehow this guy managed to keep showing up at those locations quickly to pick them up. So they did manage to bust him. But that's sort of one of the most infamous identity theft stories.
I actually hadn't heard that story. But whenabouts was that?
So that was between 2002 and 2007 when everything came to light. And it was, in a way, you could sort of blame the internet at that point for helping give him the power. When the police actually broke into his apartment after they'd arrested him, they found a Forbes magazine lying on his coffee table, and they flipped it to the page of the top 100 wealthiest. And beside 50 of them, he had their social insurance numbers. So he'd been a busy boy.
Yeah, sounds like it. So this was on identity theft, right? And so he was obviously able to impersonate seemingly up to 50 of the top 100 wealthiest. But identity theft is much more than that. I mean, it could be anybody can be a victim, right? When we were looking into this, you don't have to be wealthy. I mean, really all you have to have is almost a credit rating, which everybody has, and you could become a victim.
Yeah, I think what made me choose to talk about Abraham was the fact that he didn't actually, in this case, have to pretend to even be them. All he had to do was pretend that he was a financial advisor for them and supply enough security answers, like mother's maiden name and things like that, in order to convince the banks to let him have access to those people's money. And I think that's kind of an important part of what we'll be talking about in this show is, we touched a little bit on identity theft in the last show, but in this one, I want to make sure people understand the impact and the cause, why it is they're actually going after information and how it can be used against you.
Yeah, so we had another show you're talking about, the phishing sites show, right? And that was where we were exploring the dangers of phishing sites and phishing scams and how those would happen. So we talked about, phone scams and email scams, and ultimately it was somehow trying to get your information to then ultimately benefit financially. And identity theft is somewhat the same and somewhat different. It's really about information, right? In both cases, the thief is trying to get information, but how they use that information is very different. Where I think phishing sites, for example, they'll try to get your username and password, say, to your bank account or something, and then try to access that and do a transfer. Where identity theft can be that simple, but can also be a little bit more sophisticated. Before we get into that too much, I did get a chance to interview Constable George from the RCMP. And she had some answers, and her first was, of course, what is identity theft and their definitions. So just give me a second to pull that up.
Great.
Sure. Identity theft is when someone wrongfully obtains and uses another person's identifying information for the purposes of fraud or other criminal activity. Typically, this is used for economic gain or criminal activity.
So Constable George is talking about getting information, and so I mean, identity theft has been going around for some time, and I kind of feel like people are a little numb to it, numb to identity theft, and they're a little bit more aware of something like phishing sites or those types of scams. But identity theft is still very real, and it's kind of interesting. So that was RCMP's definition of identity theft. You had an example of identity theft where he was basically impersonating a financial advisor.
Right.
For some people. I'm just trying to think if there's another definition we could give the audience about what identity theft is to really help kind of ground it. And maybe doing that would be better kind of switching into how they get your information. But I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that first.
No, I think that makes sense as far as I think I defer to you on that. I mean, you're the one you've worked with federal governments and the Department of Defense. As clients, I'm sure that they're absolutely terrified about their private data, especially things that relate to identities of, say, staff or citizens.
Yeah, for sure. They're definitely strict about security, and the internet has a multitude of threats, and this is one of them that we'll often consult on. And so going back to my other question about how do they get your information? There's a multitude of ways, and some of them are similar to phishing sites, so some of them will still come through as emails, and maybe they'll spoof as your bank or something like that. And then they'll also, did they talk about in that story how he got their information? I mean, I don't know if his position as a busboy gave him access to credit card info or something like that, but...
No, actually, his position as a busboy gave him a cover because no one believed a busboy could be capable of pulling this off.
Okay. The reason why I ask is because often there can be times with retail stores where they can what's called double swipe your credit card, or somehow when you are trusting that retailer with your credit card, they can still get your credit card information. So I just didn't know if somehow he was in that position. But that's another way that identity theft can be stolen. Or we alluded to this again in the phishing site episode where there are these banks that call you and say, hey, I'm Visa, and can you confirm for us your postal code or your zip code, or before we proceed, or something like that. But really what they're doing is when you give them that postal code or zip code, they're just putting that into a database, and then they slowly build that up after every 3 months or 6 months or whatever. They might call you and say, hey, I'm Visa, and can you confirm your phone number? And then you give them their phone number to confirm, but then they're just actually putting that in.
Yep.
Things like that. So, but just going back to Constable George from the RCMP, she had an example, what she was calling dumpster diving, which was another way that people might get your information. Just let me pull that up here.
A good example of that is if you live in an apartment building and where they have those mailboxes, and there is right beside the mailboxes a garbage can. So what often happens is people throw their junk mail in those garbage cans. Well, that's a perfect spot for these criminals to come grab some mail that's been thrown in that garbage, so dumpster diving, and grab that mail and use the identity within those junk mail and use as false identities, because often in those junk mails include such things as credit card applications and things like that.
Her example of dumpster diving was the junk mail. If a credit card company sends you one of those pre-authorized applications, you've been pre-approved for a $5,000 credit card or something like that. Just fill out the form, and a lot of people just throw those out without shredding them, and that has at least your name and your address on it, and possibly more information. And if that gets in the wrong hands, maybe they're filling out that credit card form on your behalf or something, if they have enough information to do that. And then now they have a credit card in your name that they can now start running transactions on.
Yeah, I think that'd actually be really easy to do. I mean, you get a hold of the form, and then you just take it away. You keep the individual's name, but you just change the address on it as though your address has changed. The card gets mailed to whichever location you're picking up the card from. You'd probably get away with it for at least 3 or 4 purchases and then ditch the card. So it's makes sense to me, actually. I'd never considered that. I'll probably start shredding mine from now on.
Yeah, start shredding that junk mail, especially if you live in an apartment building with a communal junk mailbox or something like that. Don't do that. And that's what Constable George was alluding to there. But identity theft, it's really interesting. So going back to where I think this is different is, in phishing sites, I think it's very, very direct. I got your username and your password to your bank account, and I want to transfer funds out of your account, or I've duped your friends into transferring me money thinking that I'm you or something like that. But identity theft is quite a bit different. different because you can actually you're tricking institutions, banking institutions, or something like that, or the thief, is tricking these institutions into thinking that they're you, right? And they're taking out loans or credit cards or something in your name. And so you don't really know this is happening until you either get a credit card bill in the mail, or maybe a collection agency starts calling you and saying, hey, you owe this money. And you're thinking, for what? I don't have that credit out, right? So identity theft is a very different threat, and why we felt it should be a different episode, because it's really about things being taken out in your name, and that can have some pretty serious consequences, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah, it can also be things being done in your name, which is also one of the things when I was doing a little research for the show. I discovered there's a long list of people who've actually gone to jail because someone stole their identity and proceeded to conduct crimes using their ID, and they'd have to sit in jail until they could prove differently. So it can actually be much scarier than maybe just losing a few dollars from your bank account.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing when I talk to people about this is well, how much information do they need to in order to steal your identity? And it's surprisingly little, right? So I kind of talk about a paranoia spectrum, if you will, and everybody sits differently on that paranoia spectrum about how much information they feel comfortable telling the public, posting on their Facebook or something like that, and how much they feel should be private. And everybody has a different idea of what that is. But in order to accomplish identity theft, it can be surprisingly very little information required. An email address or a physical address, full name, and a date of birth. Any combination of those can start to identify an individual in North America very quickly, right? And I can most forms just require that much information, maybe a little bit more. If they can get a hold of your social insurance number or a credit card number or anything like that, that's golden. They can really run pretty far with that, but even just an address and a date of birth can be quite a lot of information.
Yeah, and there are some online examples of identity theft that don't even require that much information. There's plenty of examples of people who've had their name and photo used to talk to organizations or to even draw likes to a page, who later find out someone else is using their profile or their name online just to draw an attention to that. And that's also identity theft. It's unfortunately, in that case, it's a very minor form that can be damaging to the person, but really there's very little you can do about it. So
you must be talking about, I'm not familiar with that either. You must be talking about maybe some of the times you're working at Google or something, but you're talking about someone impersonating another individual online, like, maybe a famous person or something like that, and opening a Twitter account or Facebook page. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, I just saw an example yesterday where a so-called charity Facebook page had posted a picture of a woman with her head shaved and said, despite her cancer, isn't she beautiful? Go ahead and give her likes or something. And then about 100 comments into that article, or 100 comments into her feed there on Facebook, the actual woman popped in herself and said, first of all, I do not have cancer. Secondly, stop using my image and my identity to get likes for your page. And she called them a number of explicit things, but she was quite unhappy. It turns out that they've actually been using her identity as though she's somehow affiliated with the site, and that she's someone who's surviving cancer. And in truth, she is actually just a lady who decided to shave her head. But that's one of those ways that they can take your identity as well.
Sure. Yeah, and so that's not so much economical gain out of the victim's pocket. Maybe by getting those likes, then they can promote their products, so they can get economic gain that way. But identity theft, say for the average user that might be listening to the show, they may not have that similar threat. Their online reputation might be in jeopardy, but not necessarily an economical threat.
Well, actually, I can probably think of a number of examples where it could be done that way. But you can't really do much about that type. If someone's going to take your picture and your name and just use it online, unfortunately, you're kind of stuck. As far as the rest of your stuff, if it's going to have a financial impact on you, I guess that's more where we're kind of focusing, because it's, preventatively, those are the things we can actually speak to.
Yeah, and so if we talk about how much information they need, and I said a name and address and date of birth, I mean, that can really be a lot. I mean, you can start filling out some applications with that information. And I've got a bit of a funny story. I was talking to my father-in-law a few weeks ago, and he had received some kind of card or something like that inside of a cereal box, right? And it was a promotional card that basically said, if you want to receive a prize, go to the website and fill out some information, right? And I think this card gave him another box of free cereal. So he goes to the website and fills out the information saying, hey, you know, I bought this product and I'm filling out the prize card and I want to claim my prize. And they had asked for the name and address, which makes sense because they want to ship him a new box. But they also asked for his full date of birth. And it didn't really, I mean, maybe from a marketing point of view, maybe they had a point for asking for his full date of birth. But you can imagine they may want somebody to agree to terms and conditions, and they want to confirm that they're over the age of 18, but you can do that with just the year of birth. But this was his full date of birth. And so that was a showstopper for him, and he decided, you know, I'm not giving them that information. And, I mean, these cereal companies, they're not out to steal your identity, but you don't know where that information's going. You don't know how secure their databases are. And if that data gets exploited, then, you know, that database would at least contain his name and address and date of birth. And that he could be, there's a chance he could be a victim of identity theft. So there's some people that I've talked to, they're like, are you kidding me? Get the free box of cereal and just, you know, who cares if they get the full date of birth? But there's a serious risk to giving out that information, especially unnecessarily.
Yeah, I'd side with your father-in-law all the way. Not a chance would I give my birth date out to some card company. I'm sure that's a third-party like survey company or some sort of a data harvester themselves. I mean, in marketing, we've got access to millions of lists of active email addresses and that at a very small price, and they've all been confirmed active through the use of junk mail or anything. If we actually wanted to use those emails, in that case, I'm sure that's just another form of data harvest. And like you said, if it was ever compromised or if that company decided to do something unethical and sell your information, having that birth date's probably all they need to roll you for who knows how much money.
Yeah, exactly. The reason why I highlight that story, I guess, is some people think that you really need to give out a lot of personal information. And when I was talking to Constable George at RCMP, sometimes the number one information that they want to try to get is like your mother's maiden name, because that's used so frequently as a password reset tool so that they can reset your password into certain accounts and get access that way. So, and some people may not think a mother's maiden name is personal, or full date of birth is personal, or even your full name and full address, which might be available in a phone book. But you start putting that data together, and you can do some pretty serious damage in the wrong hands. I just want to take a short break, highlight our sponsor, RefBox, a bit, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit further about how you can protect yourself from identity theft.
Protect your children from the dangerous side of the internet. Introducing the RefBox. The RefBox filters all devices connected to your home network, tablets, Macs, PCs, and more. And there's no software installation needed. Simply plug in the box and your family is protected against adult content, extreme violence, and dangerous phishing sites. Learn more by visiting refbox.ca. That's REF, refbox.ca. RefBox. Keep your kids in bounds.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Rob and Tristan Show. We're talking today about identity theft. So, Rob, we've already covered, what is identity theft, that it's a very different threat than phishing sites, which we covered in another episode. Identity theft is really somebody trying to impersonate you, right? And we covered how they get your information, what kind of information they're after.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about preventative measures, right? And what can users and average people do to protect themselves against this threat of identity theft?
There's a vast number of things. One is being very careful what you post on social networks, what you share in your emails. In the case of Abraham, he was actually able to find interviews in magazines where some of these people had actually given out an email address. And through those email addresses, he was able to track down more information, and he was able to use the Whois database to collect more information and so on. So I think a big part of it is just being conscious of the fact that when you're putting all that information out there, who am I actually giving this to? Stop and read the fine print. Is this going to a third party? Does the company you're giving information to supply these things to third parties? Any of those things would certainly be a good step in it. So I guess the way to look at it is, I said this before, I'll say it again, don't trust anything. Just
be vigilant, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and being vigilant in a number of ways. So when we were talking about what kind of information they need, just name and address and date of birth is substantial, but definitely never give out your social insurance number, and definitely never give out credit card numbers unless you absolutely have to, and make sure that it's a secure source and things like that. I just want to touch a little bit on some stuff about protecting yourself, but I think one of the most important things I want to talk about is what kind of impact this can have on your life if, in fact, you become a victim of identity theft, and things you can do from that. So, but before we go there, when I was speaking to Constable George from the RCMP, she was talking about a service that Equifax and TransUnion have. And so in Canada, there's only two big credit bureaus, Equifax and TransUnion, and they both have a subscription service that I wasn't aware of, but you had said you had heard of it, to help protect you against identity theft.
Yes.
This is what she said.
For a minimal fee now, you can pay per month to put a flag on your account so that if anyone else does try to use your identity to open any loans or mortgages, that you'll be notified prior to them being able to do that. And that often helps as well.
So identity theft is different, say, than a phishing site attack, because a phishing site attack, well, they're using your information to impersonate you to say facilitate a transaction. Identity theft is really taking out some kind of credit in your name is one of the most common attacks, right? So it can be as small as taking out a credit card, which is a big deal, but it could be as big as taking out, say, a mortgage, right? I could actually buy a house in Rob's name, and Rob wouldn't know that until he finds out that I've been paying the bills, and a mortgage lender is coming down on him saying, "Why aren't you paying your bills? You owe me for this house." And he didn't even know he owned a house that I had bought on his behalf, right? So just to switch gears a little bit to the victim. And so in the scenario that I spoke about, Rob, I'm the identity thief, and I've stolen Rob's identity, and I've bought a house, right, in your name. What kind of remedies are you looking at, and what I mean? I almost consider it a little asymmetrical, because it's not like Tristan has taken your identity and bought this house, and now you're dealing with Tristan. Tristan's taking your identity and bought this house, and you're dealing with banks now, right? And you're saying, I didn't buy that house.
Yeah, it's banks, or you could be dealing with the government, tax collectors. You could be dealing with any of these agencies. So there's plenty of horror stories, unfortunately, that go along with people who've had this happen, where they've had student loans taken out of their name, where their name's actually been used in line with people who've taken out money, which they would now count as money to the war on terror. And they've had to explain themselves through, multiple acts or hire lawyers to defend themselves. So, but those are very extreme cases. I mean, we're talking 1 in every 100,000 cases is that kind of extreme. And most common, I think, is the credit card. Most people are trying to apply for a credit card with your information, and the easier they can get one with the least amount of information possible, the more likely they are to use it. I kind of think one of the best ways to define the difference between phishing and identity theft specifically is that phishing is how they attempt to get your information, and identity theft is essentially what they use the information to do. And so I think that protecting yourself from phishing is also an excellent way to prevent having your identity stolen in the first place. But once it's actually done, there's, I guess all you can do is you let law enforcement know, potentially look at hiring a lawyer, talk to the institutions that you may have been impacted with. I know, I'm actually an Equifax customer. I think my service is $5 a month, and they're supposedly scanning the deep web, looking to see if my credit cards, if anything's been compromised, relating to my ID. I think that's a pretty worthwhile service, to know that, they're looking for it. And of course, in the event that something's happened that hurts your credit, then you would take it to Equifax or TransUnion to dispute the matter.
Yeah, when I was talking to Constable George about that, she was saying, just to highlight Constable George from the RCMP, she was saying that the victims, it's just a lot of work, right? Let's put it this way. If I'm a bank and I lended Rob a credit card, and he racks up $5,000 of charges and doesn't pay the bill, as a bank, I'm going to come down and say, hey, you didn't pay your bill. And if I can't decipher between whether that's the real Rob or the fake Rob, I'm going to get the same story, right? Rob's going to say, I didn't do that. So how does the banks really know if they were a victim of identity theft or not? So as a victim, it's a very much an uphill battle. And Constable George, I think it cited about $1,500 typically you'd have to pay in legal fees if you have to go that route. But ultimately, it's just going to take a lot of time and energy of trying to explain your situation and try to reverse charges and get a hold of Equifax and TransUnion and try to watch for any other credit that may have been taken out in your name and try and stop that. So if you consider all that hassle you have to go through compared to maybe $5 a month or whatever it is for a service that could prevent all that from happening in the first place, it seems pretty worthwhile.
Yeah.
And so just kind of recapping some of the ways that they could get that information, aside from typical internet phishing stuff, which we covered in the other episode, was junk mail. Junk mail is a big one, especially if your junk mail happens to go in a communal area. Phone calls. Constable George highlighted a few times. Don't give out information, especially if they've called you. Don't give out information. Say somebody calls and says, I'm from Bell Canada and I want to talk to you about a promotion or something like that. Just say, that's great. I'll call you back, and hang up the phone and call back the number that's on their website. And don't call back the number that they gave you, right? All these steps to try to prevent your information from getting out there. If using my father-in-law's example, if you're going to a website and they need more information than they really require, right? So for him, he was trying to get a prize, and they wanted to know his name and address, which is fine because they want to ship him the prize. But then they wanted to know his full date of birth. Well, that was a flag. They don't need his full date of birth, and if that data got compromised, then he could be a risk.
Yeah, and there's other things too. Maybe consider not using your mother-in-law or your mom's maiden name as part of your password. I know that if I was to go about trying to steal someone's identity and I was after that as long as I could get their email address or a domain name they might own, I'd be able to pull quite a bit of information from that. And now knowing their first and last name, I'd be able to go to something like Ancestry.com and then and potentially look up their mom's name right there. So maybe a good idea is to reconsider which security questions you're choosing when you're populating information.
That's interesting about security questions, and I haven't really talked about this before. I've got lots of little tricks and secrets that we use and even advise people on when it comes to security online. And one of them is about security questions is that we pretty much lie on all of them, right? And so, what is your mother's maiden name? Scott. I don't know. It's something, totally different than what my mother's actually maiden name is. And I'm not going to use Scott on all the websites, right? And I can use different maiden names across different websites, and we just document that on either internal systems or different secure ways that we would keep that recorded. Yeah, in fact, and sometimes I just go kind of the complete opposite. I'll give you an example. My wife can't stand volleyball, and I had to set up an account for her online, and it said, and some of you can't make up your own questions sometimes. They are pre-populated questions, and one of them is what is your favorite sport? And so instead of putting what her favorite sport was, I in fact put volleyball, knowing that wasn't her. It was a little bit of fun that I was having with her as well. But like you were saying, if I can just go to Ancestry.com and find out your mother's maiden name, and that's all that I need to reset your account to then achieve my goal, just lie about it. It doesn't have to. They're not verifying it. They just it's a tool for you to reset your password if you forget it. So make sure you keep that in a safe place and know that you gave the wrong information. But it's another way to try to thwart these types of attacks. Just watching the time here, and I just want to know if there's anything else we wanted to cover about identity theft before we wrap up.
No, I think that we have covered it pretty tightly.
Okay. So just to recap then, identity theft is essentially somebody impersonating you to ultimately try to maybe take out a loan or a credit card in your name, and it can be very difficult to fight back if you were in fact a victim, and can be very costly both in time and in money. So protect yourself. Use secure passwords. If you get junk mail, especially pre-approved credit cards, things like that, shred it and don't throw it away in a communal area unopened. And possibly look at subscribing to the service from a credit bureau or from a bank or something like that would help to watch your credit and see if someone is taking out a credit in your name without you knowing about it. So you've been listening to The Rob and Tristan Show. We've been talking about identity theft. Today's show has been brought to you by RefBox. RefBox, keeping your kids in bounds. Thanks, everybody, and have a good day.